What if the smartest country on Earth was hiding in plain sight and almost nobody was talking about it? Think about that for a second. When people debate the greatest nations in the world, they throw out names like the United States, China, Germany, Japan, big countries with big histories and big armies. But tucked away at the southern tip of Malaysia, there is a tiny island nation that has quietly pulled off something that no other country in human history has ever done. It went from having absolutely nothing, not even clean water, to becoming one of the most advanced, most educated, and most prosperous places on the entire planet. All in about 60 years. That is not a slow burn success story. That is a rocket ship. And yet, when people talk about the world's greatest countries, Singapore barely gets mentioned. So today, we are going on a journey to find out why that is. We are going to unpack 10 jaw-dropping reasons why Singapore is the smartest country in the world, and why the world keeps looking the other way. By the end of this video, you are going to see this tiny island in a completely different light. So let's get into it.
Point 1. From nothing to everything in 60 years. Let us start at the very beginning, because the story of Singapore is honestly one of the most unbelievable stories of human achievement ever told. In 1965, Singapore was kicked out of Malaysia. Yes, you read that right. They were not given independence because people believed in them. They were literally forced out. The Prime Minister at the time, Kuan Yew, famously cried on national television when it happened. This was a tiny island of less than 3 million people. No natural resources, no oil, no gold, no farmland to speak of, no military, not even enough clean drinking water, as they had to import it from Malaysia. By every measure of logic, Singapore should have failed. It should have collapsed into poverty like so many newly independent nations of that era did. But here is the thing about Singapore. It did not fail. Instead, it looked at its only real resource, its people, and decided to build the smartest, most disciplined, most educated population on Earth. 50 years later, Singapore has a GDP per capita that beats the United States. It has airports that make others look like bus stations. It has a school system that tops global rankings year after year. From zero to world class in 60 years. That is not just impressive. That is legendary.
Point 2. The education system that the world cannot beat. Now, if Singapore started with nothing, the first thing it had to do was invest in its people. And that investment in education is exactly where the magic began. Year after year in global education rankings, Singapore sits right at the top. In the PISA rankings, which measure the academic performance of 15-year-olds around the world, Singapore consistently outperforms countries like Finland, South Korea, Japan, and the United States. But what makes Singapore's education system so special is not just that students score high on tests, it is the philosophy behind the whole system. From a very young age, Singapore teaches children to think critically, to solve problems creatively, and to never be satisfied with shallow understanding. Math is taught with a method known around the world as the Singapore math approach. It starts with real physical objects, moves to pictures, and then moves to abstract numbers. It sounds simple, but it is incredibly powerful. Teachers in Singapore are not just hired and forgotten. They are treated like professionals, paid well, and trained constantly. Countries like the United States have actually tried to import the Singapore math method into their own schools because it works so well. When your educational approach is being borrowed by the most powerful country on Earth, you know you are doing something right.
Point 3. A government that actually plans ahead.
Here is something that will genuinely surprise you. Singapore's government makes 50-year plans. Think about the politicians in most countries. They are worried about the next election, maybe 4 or 5 years away. They make promises that sound good today and worry about consequences later. Singapore operates on a completely different timeline. The government there thinks in decades. It plans infrastructure, housing, education, and economic strategy not for the next election cycle, but for the next generation. One stunning example is water. Remember, Singapore had no natural water supply. Instead of accepting that as a permanent problem, the government invested massively in water recycling technology. Today, Singapore collects rainwater, recycles used water so thoroughly it calls the result newater, and even desalinates seawater. They turned a catastrophic weakness into a model that countries around the world now study. Singapore also planned its housing decades in advance. Over 80% of Singaporeans live in government-built housing that is clean, affordable, and incredibly well managed. The government saw a problem, made a long-term plan, and executed it with precision. That is the kind of governance that most countries only dream of. Point 4. The port that runs the world. Now, here is something most people do not know about Singapore, and when you hear it, your jaw is going to drop. Singapore is one of the busiest ports on the entire planet. At any given moment, hundreds of massive cargo ships are either docked in Singapore or passing through its waters. The country sits at the crossing point between the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, right at the Strait of Malacca, one of the most important shipping lanes in human history. About 1/5 of all global trade passes through that strait, and Singapore made sure it was right there to take advantage of it. The Port of Singapore is not just big, it is a marvel of organization and technology. Ships can be loaded, unloaded, refueled, and sent back out to sea with stunning speed. It is like a pit stop for the global economy. The whole operation runs with such precision that shipping companies from every country on Earth choose Singapore as a key hub. This tiny island with no natural resources turned its geographic location into. Point 5. One of the least corrupt places on Earth. Speaking of trust, let us talk about something that most countries struggle with deeply: corruption. Corruption is one of the biggest reasons why nations fail. When politicians steal public money, when police take bribes, when contracts go to the wrong people because of backroom deals, the whole system falls apart. Citizens lose faith, businesses leave, talent goes elsewhere. Singapore made a decision very early on to fight corruption with every tool it had, and it worked. Today, Singapore is consistently ranked as one of the least corrupt nations in the world by organizations like Transparency International. The civil service there is paid extremely well, which removes the temptation to take bribes. There are strict laws against corruption, and they are actually enforced. The same rules apply to everyone, including the most senior politicians and government officials. There is a famous story of a minister in Singapore who was investigated for corruption and eventually took his own life because of the shame. The point is not the tragedy, but the fact that even the most powerful people faced real consequences. When ordinary citizens see that no one is above the law, they begin to trust the system. And when people trust the system, the whole country runs more smoothly and more fairly.
Point 6. An economy built like a chess master. At this point, you might be wondering how exactly Singapore makes its money, and the answer reveals just how brilliantly the country was designed. Singapore has no oil, no minerals, no vast agricultural lands. So instead of competing in industries that require natural resources, it chose to become the world's best at things that require brains. Finance is one of the biggest pillars. Singapore is the 4th largest foreign exchange trading center in the world. Massive banks and investment firms from every continent have offices there.
Pharmaceuticals and biotechnology are another big piece. Companies like GlaxoSmithKline and Pfizer have major manufacturing and research operations in Singapore. Electronics, chemicals, and advanced manufacturing round out the picture. But here is the truly clever part. Singapore keeps reinventing itself. When low-cost manufacturing moved to cheaper countries, Singapore moved up the value chain into higher technology industries. When global finance expanded, Singapore positioned itself as the safe, stable, well-regulated hub of Asian finance. It never stood still. It never rested on past success. It kept asking the question, what does the world need next, and how can we be the best at providing it? That constant reinvention is the mark of a truly intelligent economy.
Point 7. Healthcare that punches way above its weight. Here is a question for you. What country would you want to get sick in? If you thought about comfort, quality of care, and efficiency, Singapore should be very near the top of your list. The World Health Organization has consistently ranked Singapore as having one of the best healthcare systems on Earth. The infant mortality rate is one of the lowest in the world. Life expectancy is among the highest. Hospitals are clean, well-staffed, and equipped with cutting-edge technology. But what makes Singapore's healthcare model truly fascinating is how it is funded. Instead of going fully public like the United Kingdom or fully private like the United States, Singapore built a hybrid model. Every working citizen puts a portion of their salary into a personal health savings account called MediSave. They use that money to pay for medical care. The government subsidizes care for lower-income citizens, and there are safety nets for catastrophic illnesses. The result is a system where individuals feel responsible for their own health, where costs are kept in check, and where no one falls through the cracks completely. Other countries spend years debating healthcare reform. Singapore built a system that actually works and kept improving it.
Point 8. Safety that feels like science fiction. Let us take a moment to talk about something that might seem simple, but is actually profound. In Singapore, you can walk the streets at night and feel completely safe. That might not sound revolutionary, but think about how rare that actually is in a major global city. Singapore consistently ranks as one of the safest countries on the planet. The crime rate is extraordinarily low. Violent crime is almost unheard of. The streets are clean, well-lit, and patrolled. People leave their laptops on cafe tables to save a seat while they get coffee, and nobody touches them. To outsiders, some of Singapore's laws might seem strict. Chewing gum is banned for sale in certain contexts. Vandalism is punished harshly. Drug trafficking carries severe penalties. These rules are controversial, and there are real debates about personal freedom. But the result is a city where people from every background feel genuinely safe. Parents let their children take public transport.
Point 9. A tiny country doing giant things for the environment. Here is something that does not get nearly enough attention. Singapore, a country smaller than the city of London, is doing some of the most ambitious environmental work on the planet. Singapore has almost no land. There are no vast forests to absorb carbon, no wide-open plains for massive solar farms. And yet, the country has committed to becoming one of the most sustainable nations in the world. There are solar panels on the rooftops of tens of thousands of public housing buildings. The government is investing in floating solar farms on reservoirs. Singapore has set ambitious targets to peak its carbon emissions well before 2030. The city-state is also a pioneer in urban greenery. Buildings are covered in plants. Vertical gardens climb skyscrapers. The famous Gardens by the Bay, with its giant tree-like structures that generate solar energy and collect rainwater, is not just beautiful. It is a model for how cities of the future might look. Singapore is also working on lab-grown food technologies and investing in urban farming to reduce dependence on food imports.
In a world where most governments struggle to agree on even the basics of environmental policy, Singapore is quietly building tomorrow's city today. It is thinking about problems that most countries haven't even started worrying about yet.
Point 10. The secret ingredient is the people. After everything we have talked about, after all the incredible systems, the brilliant planning, the world-class infrastructure, there is one final thing that ties it all together, and it is the most important thing of all. The people of Singapore are genuinely extraordinary. This is a country where 4 official languages are spoken: English, Mandarin, Malay, and Tamil. It is a place where Chinese, Malay, Indian, and Eurasian communities live side by side in one of the most densely populated places on Earth. And mostly, it works. It works because generations of Singaporeans were taught from childhood that their diversity is a strength, not a problem. It works because the culture values hard work, education, and collective responsibility. It works because people actually believe in the place they come from. Singapore should not exist. By every logical measure of geography and history, it should be a struggling, developing nation. But it is not. And the reason it is not comes down to millions of individual human beings who decided every single day to show up, to work hard, to trust their institutions, and to build something worth being proud of. That is the real miracle of Singapore. Not the buildings, not the port, not the laws. The people who made all of it possible.
And there you have it. 10 reasons why Singapore is quietly one of the most extraordinary nations the world has ever seen. We started with a tiny island that was kicked out of its own country with nothing to its name. No water, no resources, no army, nothing but the will to survive and the intelligence to turn a crisis into an opportunity. And what did Singapore do with that? It built one of the best education systems in history. It created an economy that the whole world depends on. It built a government that plans 50 years ahead. It made its streets some of the safest on Earth. It is tackling climate change with creativity and ambition. And it did all of this while keeping 4 different cultures living peacefully side by side. The world does not talk about Singapore enough. Maybe it is because it is small. Maybe it is because it does not start wars or dominate the news cycle. But great things are not always loud. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come from the quietest places. Singapore is proof that with the right mindset, the right leadership, and an unshakable belief in your people, anything is possible. Absolutely anything. If this video opened your eyes to something new, I want to hear from you. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. What surprised you most? What do you wish your own country would learn from Singapore? Hit that like button if you enjoyed this, and make sure you subscribe because we have so much more content like this coming your way. See you in the next one.